The kitchen is silent, lit only by the blue glare of a laptop screen. It's past midnight. A couple sits at the counter, tired. Their voices drop to sharp whispers, arguing about a $15 streaming subscription they haven't used in 6 months. It's a bitter little negotiation about discipline and waste. A few clicks, and it's canceled. They close the laptop. They exhale. For a moment, they feel something close to victory. A leak in the budget, found and patched. Financial control, reclaimed. 2 feet away, sitting in a manila folder on that same table, is the closing paperwork for their house. Last month, they signed a 30-year mortgage. The rate was half a point higher than they could have gotten elsewhere because shopping around felt complicated and the jargon was exhausting, and they just wanted the deal done. Run the numbers on a loan like that, and half a point compounded over 30 years lands somewhere around $35,000 in extra interest. Nobody wrote that number on a napkin and slid it across the table. It simply accumulated, one monthly payment at a time, invisible. Why do two intelligent adults fight bitterly over $15 a month and let something like that pass without a second thought? It isn't a failure of intelligence. In 1957, the British writer C. Northcote Parkinson described a version of this in a committee, not a kitchen. He watched a group tasked with approving a nuclear power plant spend almost no time on the reactor itself and nearly an hour arguing about what materials to use for the staff bike shed. The reactor was too complex to really argue with. The bike shed? Everyone understood. Parkinson called it the law of triviality. The amount of attention a group gives a decision runs in inverse proportion to how much the decision actually costs. He was writing about committees, but the same instinct seems to show up at a kitchen table. A mortgage is abstract, technical, and enormous. A streaming subscription is small enough to hold in your head all at once. So the argument goes where the footing feels solid.
We've been told for decades that financial success is mostly a matter of discipline, that wealth gets built through small, painful daily sacrifices. There's truth in that. Tracking spending helps. Small habits compound. But the obsession with tiny expenses can quietly become a kind of shield, keeping attention away from the larger structural decisions that do far more damage, or far more good. Nowhere is that clearer than in one of the most famous pieces of personal finance advice ever sold, The Latte Factor. In 1999, the financial author David Bach built an entire book, Smart Women Finish Rich, around a simple idea. Skip the $5 coffee, invest the difference, and compound interest turns you into a millionaire by retirement. It's a comforting story because it puts the entire mechanism of wealth inside your own morning routine. The trouble is the math underneath it. Journalist Helene Olin picked the latte factor apart in her book Pound Foolish and found that the original projections leaned on an assumed annual return of around 11%, well above what markets have realistically delivered over most stretches of history, with no accounting for inflation, fund fees, or taxes. Adjust for the real world, and the seven-figure fantasy shrinks considerably. None of that means saving $5 is pointless. It means eliminating a daily coffee is not mathematically equivalent to solving a housing crisis, a stagnant income, or a mountain of medical debt.
To see where this cultural instinct comes from, it helps to go back to the people who first wrote the rules down. It's 1926 in a small printing office in Denver. George S. Clausen, a map maker who'd built the Clausen Map Company and published the first road atlas of the United States and Canada, starts writing a series of pamphlets. He sets them in ancient Babylon, invents a cast of characters, and hands them a piece of advice that will outlive him by a century. Pay yourself first. Bound together, those pamphlets became The Richest Man in Babylon. There were no ancient tablets behind it. It was a modern sales pitch dressed as antiquity. Banks and insurance companies distributed the pamphlets by the millions, often stamping their own names on the cover, handing them to customers alongside their other products. Years later, during the Great Depression, Clausen's own map company reportedly went under, a reminder that the man who told America to save 10% no matter what wasn't immune to the forces he was writing about. A framework can mean something very different depending on who's holding it and how much power they have. Almost a century earlier, in 1829,
a Boston writer named Lydia Maria Child published The American Frugal Housewife. She wrote it, by her own account, partly because her husband's debts had left the household's finances to her. It became one of the era's most reprinted books, running through more than 30 editions. Long before anyone was selling seminars on wealth, Child was arguing that frugality wasn't a lack of ambition, it was a form of dignity, a way of refusing to be pulled under by hard times.
Decades later, in 1904, a young journalist named Hani Motoko, widely credited as Japan's first female newspaper reporter, introduced a household ledger she called kakeibo, a simple system for tracking every yen coming in and going out. She was writing in the Meiji era, when women had almost no independent legal or financial standing. A notebook and a pencil aren't much, but in a society built to keep women dependent, the ability to see your own household's numbers clearly was its own kind of leverage. Something similar happened, in a rougher form, in the industrial towns of England and America around the same period. Nobody knows exactly who first put cash into a labeled envelope, but the practice is closely tied to a cash-based, unbanked working class. People paid their wages in physical packets, with no checking account to speak of, who divided that cash by hand into envelopes for rent, coal, and food. It wasn't a wealth strategy. It was survival, made visible. And it worked, in part because of something genuinely strange about how the brain treats physical money. In a 2007 study published in the journal Neuron, researchers scanned people's brains as they decided whether to buy items at various prices. When the price felt too high, activity rose in a region called the insula, a part of the brain also implicated in processing pain and disgust in other contexts. Handing over physical cash appears to trigger a real, measurable flicker of aversion. Remove the cash, and that friction seems to fade. In 2001, two researchers at MIT ran a live auction for tickets to a sold-out Boston Celtics game. Half the bidders were told they'd pay in cash if they won. The other half were told they'd pay by credit card. The card bidders ended up offering roughly double for the identical tickets. Nothing about the tickets changed. Only the psychological distance between the bidder and the money did. That same distance shows up in an odd finding from 2009, when researchers Priya Raghabir and Joydeep Srivastava found that people are measurably less likely to spend a sum of money when it's handed to them as a single large bill than when the same amount comes as a stack of smaller ones. The value is identical. The willingness to break it apart is not. Financial advisors try to build guardrails against this. One of the more common ones is the 72-hour rule. Wait 3 days before buying anything expensive. The logic behind it isn't really about giving your budget time to catch up. It's about dopamine. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky has described a well-known line of research showing that dopamine doesn't spike when a reward arrives. It spikes during the anticipation of it. Late at night, scrolling a store with something sitting in your cart, the brain is already lit up by the chase. Waiting 72 hours simply lets that spike fade before the executive, more rational part of the brain gets a say. Trying to apply purely rational rules across an entire budget, though, tends to run into a different kind of wall. In 1969, a young manager at Texas Instruments named Peter Fire built something he called zero-based budgeting. Every dollar in every department justified from scratch each cycle, with nothing carried over from the year before. It worked well enough at Texas Instruments that Jimmy Carter, first as governor of Georgia and then as president, tried to scale it up to the entire federal government in 1977. The result was an administrative nightmare. Forcing thousands of departments to justify every line item from zero generated a mountain of paperwork the system could barely absorb. And by the time Carter left office, the federal government had largely let it go. A method that looks elegant on a whiteboard can still collapse under the sheer weight of applying it everywhere all the time. Because rigid systems are hard to sustain, simpler formulas tend to survive. In 2005, the bankruptcy law professor Elizabeth Warren and her daughter, Amelia Warren Tyagi, published All Your Worth, laying out what's now known as the 50-30-20 rule: 50% of income to needs, 30 to wants, 20 to savings. It gets repeated today as a lifestyle formula for building wealth, but that's not really where it came from. Warren had spent years researching why two-income families were going bankrupt at record rates and found that many of them had taken on housing and car payments so large that a single lost paycheck could sink them. The 50% cap wasn't a path to riches. It was a ceiling meant to keep a family from being one bad month away from collapse. Even when the math is straightforward, people don't always follow it. Imagine someone with $5,000 sitting in a savings account they've labeled their vacation fund and a $4,000 credit card balance charging them 24% interest. On paper, the answer is obvious. Pay off the card. The Nobel laureate Richard Thaler built a career studying why people don't. He called it mental accounting, the tendency to treat money as if it belongs to separate, non-interchangeable buckets, even when $1 of debt and $1 of savings are mathematically exactly the same thing. Using the vacation money to kill the debt feels like a loss, even while the balance sheet is bleeding every month it isn't touched. This same instinct, the desire for one clean rule that solves everything, shows up at the very end of the financial story too, in retirement. For decades, the benchmark for early retirement has been the 4% rule. Withdraw 4% of your portfolio in year one, adjust for inflation after that, and the money should last. It comes from a 1994 paper by the financial planner William Bengen, built on a specific historical dataset and a standard 30-year retirement horizon. Even Bengen himself hasn't treated the number as fixed. In 2025, he revisited his own research using a more diversified portfolio than his original model, and concluded the historically safe starting rate could actually run higher, closer to 4.7%, not lower. It's a useful reminder either way. A number built from historical assumptions isn't a law of physics. Change the inputs, and the number moves. And for people retiring decades earlier than 65, planning for 40 or 50 years instead of 30, many researchers who study those longer horizons argue for real caution, since a rule tuned to one time frame doesn't automatically transfer to another. Look at the whole arc of it. The bankrupt mapmaker in Denver, the housewife in Boston keeping her family's books because her husband couldn't, the journalist in Tokyo giving women a form of leverage they weren't otherwise allowed, the federal government drowning in its own paperwork, the brain lighting up in something like pain at the sight of a price tag. Budgeting matters. Discipline matters. Tracking your spending is a genuinely useful habit. But none of that is a complete explanation of wealth. What actually shapes most people's financial outcomes is income, the cost of housing, the interest rate on the loan, the drag of inflation, the tax code, and the broader economy they happen to be standing in. We're handed a microscope and told it's a telescope. Go back to that kitchen table, the canceled $15 subscription sitting next to the manila folder with the mortgage inside it. The coffee can matter, but obsessing over the coffee can also become a very comfortable way of never looking at the folder.